Welcome back to Sleepster. Tonight, we begin not just a story, but a journey. A slow and peaceful descent into the unknown. Into the most mysterious and untouched place on Earth. The deepest point in the world's oceans. A place where sunlight cannot reach. Where time moves differently, and where life takes forms that no one could have imagined. We're going far beneath the surface to a place called Challenger Deep, hidden inside the Mariana Trench. And before we begin our descent, take a deep breath, let it out gently, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time it is as you fall asleep with us tonight. It's always incredible to see how many curious dreamers are drifting across the globe, connecting through the quiet. And if this journey helps you find rest or wonder, consider liking the video so others like you can find their way here too. Now, close your eyes and let the surface of the ocean fade behind you. We're floating in the Western Pacific, thousands of kilometers from the nearest city, hovering just above. A dark patch of sea that looks no different than the rest, but below us, something vast awaits, something deeper than mountains. Our tall something shaped over millions of years by the shifting plates of the Earth's crust. Something that has held its silence through earthquakes, ice ages, and the birth and death of continents. That something is the Mariana Trench, a crescent-shaped scar carved into the seafloor where one tectonic plate slides beneath another in an ongoing subduction zone. It's not just a trench, it's a geological wound, a hidden frontier. And it stretches over 1,500 miles long and nearly 7 miles deep. Deeper than any canyon on land, deeper than even Mount Everest is tall. And within that trench, near its southern end, is Challenger Deep, the single deepest known point in Earth's oceans. Tonight, we drift gently downward, beginning our descent through the ocean layers, passing through the twilight zones of the deep sea, where light disappears, where color fades, and where the weight of water begins to press inward, like memory, like silence, like sleep. At the surface, everything is bright and blue, the sky mirrored in the ripples, clouds reflecting over the swells, waves moving gently under the wind. But as we slip beneath the surface, the color changes. Sunlight begins to bend and break. Red disappears first, then orange, then yellow, until only green and blue light can follow us. And after just a few hundred feet, even that begins to fade into a pale gray. Below 1,000 feet, left behind the sunlight zone, also known as the epipelagic zone, the part of the ocean that supports most marine life, coral reefs, fish, and photosynthesis. And now we enter the mesopelagic zone, also called the twilight zone. Here, the light grows to faint to support photosynthesis, and the temperature drops quickly. Creatures here begin to change, growing large eyes, soft bodies, and bioluminescent lures that shine softly in the darkness, blinking like stars on the edge of dreams. You may imagine this place as empty, but it's not. Small flashes drift by. Lanternfish, hatchetfish, bristlemouths, swimming slowly in near silence, their movements slow and patient. Some of them glow in soft pulses, not for beauty, but for communication, camouflage, or hunting. Bioluminescence is one of the most common languages in the deep sea, and as we drift downward, we begin to see it more and more. These lights are not random. They are signals, warnings, invitations, disguises. And all around us, as we pass deeper, the ocean becomes quieter, colder, and darker. At around 3,300 feet, we cross into the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone. There is no sunlight here, not a single photon from the surface. It is completely dark, and the pressure is now over 100 times what it is at sea level. Still, life continues. Jellyfish, squid, deep-sea, anglerfish with glowing lures, long, thin creatures with transparent bodies, and needle-like teeth drift past our vessel, unbothered by our presence. They have lived here for millions of years, adapted to pressure, darkness, and cold. Some of them have never needed eyes. Others see in wavelengths we cannot detect. And their movements are slow, almost meditative, as though time itself has softened here. In this zone, there are no waves, no tides, no sound, except for the gentle hum of our descent. The ocean is still, vast, infinite, and we are drifting through it like a feather caught in the breath of the earth. We pass deep-sea cucumbers, long threads of siphonophores, and gelatinous creatures that look like drifting clouds. Some of them have never been studied, never been named, only exist in glimpses like this. Sudden appearances in the dark, silhouettes in the soft glow of our lights. And then we pass through 13,000 feet, deeper than the wreck of the Titanic, deeper than the deepest parts of most oceans. We enter the abyssopelagic zone, also known simply as the abyss. Here, the temperature remains just above freezing, and the pressure is immense. There is no light, no sound, no landmarks, only soft slopes of sediment and the slow drift of organic matter falling from above. A never-ending rain of marine snow, made up of dead plankton, fish scales, fecal pellets, and microscopic debris. It falls for days, weeks, even months before reaching the bottom, and it feeds the life that waits there. Sea cucumbers, brittle stars, deep-sea shrimp, and filter feeders that stretch their arms into the water to catch what they can. These creatures live in the slowest ecosystem on Earth, where food is rare and every movement must be efficient. Nothing is wasted. Everything is used. But we are going deeper still. At 20,000 feet, we entered the Hadal Zone, the realm of the trenches, named after Hades, the ancient Greek god of the underworld. This zone makes up only a tiny fraction of the ocean, found only in deep-sea trenches and subduction zones like the Mariana Trench. Here, life is stranger than ever. The pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, enough to crush most submarines and destroy nearly any surface-dwelling organism. But still, life exists. Amphipods, shrimp-like scavengers, scurry across the seafloor. Giant single-celled organisms called xenophyophores rest on the sediment, absorbing nutrients through their delicate membranes. Bacteria cling to rocks near hydrothermal seeps, feeding on hydrogen and methane. Some creatures here are blind, others glow. Others have antifreeze in their blood. Evolution has taken paths here that defy imagination. In some places, we find small patches of life clustered around seeps and vents, where superheated water rich with minerals escapes from the Earth's crust. Around these seeps, microbes feed on sulfur, and larger animals, clams, mussels, tube worms, gather in dense colonies. There is no sun here, no plants, no photosynthesis. Life is powered by chemosynthesis, a process where microbes convert chemicals into energy. Entire ecosystems thrive on this process, existing in complete independence from the surface. As we continue descending into the trench, we pass 30,000 feet. We're approaching Challenger Deep. The pressure is unimaginable, over 16,000 pounds per square inch. And yet, the ocean is calm. Perfectly calm. No current, no waves. Only the slow motion of gravity and water. The walls of the trench rise around us like the cliffs of a sunken world. The floor is covered in fine silt, a soft bed of dust that has been falling here for millions of years. It holds the memory of the planet. Volcanic ash from eruptions long forgotten, particles of meteorites, fragments of life from the surface. Each layer is a page in a story we are only just beginning to read. We hover now, just above the seafloor. Lights off. Instruments quiet. Outside the vessel, the dark is absolute, but it is not empty. Life moves out there in stillness, in silence. A giant amphipod passes slowly, its long legs brushing the silt. A tiny jellyfish floats upward, its body glowing with faint pulses. And beneath them, microbes live in the mud, cycling carbon, storing memory. The trench is not a void. It is not a graveyard. It is not even a mystery. It is a mirror, a reflection of the Earth's silence, of its ancient rhythms, of everything we've forgotten how to feel in the noise of the surface. Down here, things happen slowly. Birth, death, decay, all take place over centuries. Species live without ever being seen. Movements happen without sound. And we, floating in this quiet world, are reminded that depth is not emptiness. It is presence. It is fullness. It is patience. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts settle. Let the stillness of the deep hold you as we prepare to explore what lies even deeper. The trench has welcomed us. Now it will show us more. As we continue drifting in the slow fall of gravity's quiet pull, deeper than sound, deeper than surface storms, deeper than history's footprints, the world outside our vessel becomes even softer, even darker, even more silent, and yet strangely more alive, because there's something that happens at this depth, somewhere beyond 33,000 feet, where the absence of light and sound, eyes and tea, emptiness but a kind of presence. Thick and real, like a hum without vibration, like a dream you've been having all your life but only just remembered. And here in this blackness, we begin to leave behind the last traces of what we once thought the ocean was. Because down here, the sea is not a liquid, not a place, not even a direction. It becomes an environment so complete, so total, so enveloping that it starts to behave more like time than space, more like silence than water. And as we descend, letting the vessel drift closer to the trench floor, we begin to notice how even our thoughts start to stretch. And slow, how they drift in long loops rather than arrive in bursts, how the pressure outside begins to shape not just our vessel, but our attention. Because this kind of pressure, over 16,000 pounds per square inch. Dosen. Tea just sit around you like weight. It changes everything, the way water moves, the way molecules behave, even the way life expresses itself. And we realize very gently that nothing about the deep is accidental, that everything here is shaped by necessity, by constraint, by time and darkness, and the absence of waste. And so the creatures that live here are not flawed or alien, but precise, elegant, impossibly refined, not despite their environment, but because of it. Floating beside a long, smooth slope of trench wall, we watch as tiny flecks of marine snow continue to fall from above. A slow, endless drizzle of life's forgotten pieces. Bits of dead plankton. Discarded scales, excreted carbon, the bones of thoughts that never made it to shore. All drifting downward for weeks, for months. Falling from surface waters where sunlight rules, down into this kingdom of dark patience. And these tiny, weightless particles feed everything down here. Because when energy is rare, nothing can be wasted. And so entire food webs rise from this fall of dust. Bacteria feed on the rain. Small filter feeders feed on the bacteria, larger creatures feed on them, and the cycle continues, endlessly slow, endlessly quiet. And as we drift along the seafloor, our lights lower our speed. Barely perceptible, we begin to see the forms that call this realm home. And they appear not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as if revealing themselves in layers. First, a shadow in the water, then a glint of bioluminescence, then the subtle movement of long fins or delicate limbs. And it's in this unveiling that we begin to understand what it means to evolve without light, without sound, without rush. A long-bodied fish floats into view, its form almost fluid, skin translucent. Eyes reduced to faint shadows beneath the surface, and it does not swim, not really, but drifts, using small, controlled flicks of its tail to correct its position, to guide itself gently through the thick water, and following it, a pale octopus, barely the size of your hand, unfolds from a fold in the sediment, lifting one soft arm after another as it glides away, its body pulsing with faint electric blue as it vanishes into the dark, not fleeing, not hiding, just existing in the only way that makes sense here. With grace, with economy, with total attention to energy, and further along, we notice a mound of sediment shifting slowly, and from it, a cluster of amphipods emerges, shrimp-like scavengers with curved exoskeletons and twitching antennae. moving together in what feels almost like choreography, sensing not with sight or sound, but with pressure, with chemical traces in the water, with memory passed not through language, but through behavior, through survival. In a small depression just ahead, we see an unusual glimmer, not bright, but consistent, and we approach slowly to find a patch of bioluminescent bacteria coating a cluster of rocks, glowing in soft green-blue pulses that spread and contract like breathing, and surrounding them, a film of microbial life forms a mat so fine it looks like velvet, feeding on chemical seeps from deep within the earth, places where tectonic stress has allowed mineral-rich water to escape, warmed by the planet's crust, and here, in this chemical warmth, life gathers, not in chaos, not in competition, but in balance. And we see tube worms, small clams, and strange gelatinous things growing in quiet stillness. And it feels more like a forest than an ocean, more like a temple than a trench, and we hover there, breath slowing again, watching the movement not of creatures, but of relationships, of flows and exchanges, of cycles that do not require us to name them in order to continue. We pass a shelf of basalt, cracked and weathered by time its edges, softened by sediment, and resting on its edge is what looks like a thin glass sculpture, a deep-sea siphonophore hundreds of feet long, barely visible, drifting with the current like a single organism, though in truth it's a colony. Hundreds of individual creatures living as one, each with its role, each with its place. And we watch it pulse and move, trailing its luminous body behind it, feeding as it drifts, sensing its world through the faintest changes in pressure and temperature. And it reminds us that life does not require eyes or limbs or minds like ours to be profound, that intelligence takes many forms, that organization does not require hierarchy, and that cooperation is not always noisy or structured, but can instead be quiet, inherent, embodied in form. Around us, the trench narrows again, the walls drawing inward slightly, as though the earth is folding in on itself. And we see cracks in the rock, glowing faintly with mineral crusts, manganese, nodules, iron oxides, traces of rare earth elements embedded in formations that have been forming for thousands, even millions of years, layers upon layers of chemistry and time, untouched by sunlight, by weather, by human interference, and yet not entirely untouched, because here and there, half buried in the silt, we find reminders of the surface world. A piece of metal corroded, but unmistakably artificial, perhaps from an old probe. A thin filament of plastic entangled in sponge-like growth, and it becomes clear that even here, in this untouched realm, our presence has arrived. Not as explorers, but as debris, as shadows of choices made far above, and it's humbling, not because we expect otherwise, but because the deep receives even this without complaint, absorbing the remnants into its sediment, turning even our waste into geology. And then, just ahead, something moves. Slow, large, deliberate, and it takes a moment to recognize the shape, because it is so unlike anything on the surface. A large, soft-bodied creature, perhaps a deep-sea gulper eel or something yet unnamed. Its jaw expanding wider than its own head, eyes vestigial, body long and ribbon-like, moving not with urgency, but with inevitability. Each pulse of its tail sending it forward in slow arcs, and as it vanishes again into the black, we are left not with fear, but with awe. Not because it is monstrous, but because it is possible. Because it exists. Because life has found a way not just to survive here, but to belong, to thrive, and suddenly the word alien begins to lose meaning. Because if the trench can create such forms, perhaps we've been looking for the wrong kind of life in the wrong kind of sky. And so we drift on, deeper into this abyssal silence. Not as intruders, not as observers, but as something closer to pilgrims, not here to measure or conquer, but to witness, to listen, to understand that the world we live in is deeper than we've been told, that the earth is not just surface and sky, but vast layers of unknown, of rhythm, of balance, and that this trench, this hidden fold in the ocean floor, holds a memory not of civilization, but of origin, a place where life began, not in warmth and light, but in cold and dark, in pressure and patience. And as you breathe now, slowly, letting the weight of all this settle into your bones, you may begin to feel that pressure, not as something to resist, but something to receive, because the deeper we go, the more we remember that we too are made of oceans, that we too evolved from silence, that we too carry darkness within us, not as emptiness, but as a kind of knowing. The deeper we drift, the more the world above becomes a fading myth, a memory flickering somewhere on the edge of thought, like a dream half forgotten before you even open your eyes. And here, where no sun has ever touched, where even bioluminescent flickers have grown rare, we begin to feel the true nature of the deep, not just as a place, but as a presence, a feeling, a slow and quiet weight that presses not only on the vessel, but also on the thoughts themselves, softening them, slowing them, stretching them like smoke caught in a vacuum. And at this depth, beyond the reach of surface logic, the pressure is so immense that the normal laws of our world feel far away, abstract, almost irrelevant. Because down here, the pressure is not just a measurement, it is an environment, a sculptor, a force so total that every single living thing that calls this realm home must bow to it, adapt to it, build itself around it. And so the creatures here are shaped not by choice, but by necessity, not by conquest, but by surrender. And perhaps that is what makes them so compelling, because here, in the grip of 16,000 atmospheres, nothing survives that insists on resisting. Only what yields, what listens, what becomes soft and subtle and slow, remains. Outside our small vessel, the world is nearly featureless at first glance. A wide and undisturbed plain of sediment and stone. But if you look closely, if you slow down and truly look, you begin to notice details, thousands of them. The kind that hides in simplicity, in repetition, in patience. Tiny ripple marks on the seafloor left by ancient currents. Filamenthan trails etched by microscopic worms. Small depressions where amphipods have clustered to feed. And as we move forward in near silence, these small signs of life become more frequent. Not more dramatic, not louder or larger, but more intricate, more interconnected. And we begin to understand that life down here is not defined by visibility, but by rhythm, by flow, by a kind of slow-motion choreography that takes place across years, decades, even centuries, and in this quiet theater. Nothing rushes, nothing interrupts, everything waits for its moment. And when it comes, it arrives completely, without hesitation or regret. We pass a narrow ridge rising gently from the sediment, its surface coated in fine layers of manganese nodules and ancient volcanic dust, and resting there we see a creature so still we almost miss it. A snailfish pale and gelatinous, its body shaped like a long teardrop, its fins delicate as paper, its mouth open slightly, tasting the water not with hunger but with curiosity. And it watches us without fear, not because it understands what we are, but because fear requires urgency, and urgency does not live down here. And as we watch it drift away, its body undulating with almost invisible movements, we feel the pressure again, not just physical, but emotional, the weight of time, of scale, of realizing how little we truly understand how vast and complex and ancient the planet is beneath our feet, and how little we've touched it, how rarely we've looked, how much we've assumed. Not far from the snailfish, a group of small amphipods pick apart a decaying sponge, their bodies overlapping as they feed antennae twitching limbs, shifting gently, and though the scene is silent, it is full of language. A communication built on movement spacing, chemical cues, and inherited instinct, and around them, life accumulates. Worms, microbes, minute crustaceans, barely visible even in the lights, forming a microcosm on a single patch of sediment, to quiet, thriving universe that has likely never been seen by human eyes until this very moment, and perhaps never will be again. And that realization that this moment is both ordinary and miraculous makes the silence feel deeper, more sacred. Like the hush that falls over a forest in winter, or the stillness of an empty cathedral before the first echo. And we stay there, hovering, watching, not needing to do anything, not needing to explain, just letting the presence of life speak its own quiet truths. Ahead, we see the faint glimmer of bioluminescence, not flashing, not dazzling, but pulsing in slow, hypnotic intervals, and we follow it to its source. A comb jelly suspended in the water column, its translucent body rimmed with rows of cilia that refract our lights into shimmering waves of soft color. And it rotates slowly, not spinning, but turning like a planet, like a thought turning itself over. And as we approach, it doesn't flee, it simply continues, its lights shifting slightly. Perhaps in response to our presence, perhaps in rhythm with something deeper, something older. And we find ourselves staring. Not because it is strange, but because it is beautiful in a way that defies category. Not like a flower, not like a star, but like a concept. Made visible like stillness itself, decided to wear color for a moment before disappearing again into the dark. At this depth, sound does not travel well, not because it's too loud, but because it's too dense. Water at these pressures carries vibration differently. And so communication is felt, not heard, sensed through touch, through resonance, through currents that ripple more like emotion than force. And it makes us wonder what else the creatures here can sense. Changes in gravity, shifts in magnetism, the faint hum of the planets turning, the chemical shadows of life long gone. And perhaps it is not that they are primitive, but that they are tuned to things we have long forgotten how to feel. And we begin to wonder, too, about ourselves, how we move through our world, how we sense, how we speak, and whether our constant noise is a form of blindness, a refusal to listen deeply, to sink into the spaces between our thoughts. The places where intuition and instinct and ancient memory live, floating now above a small trench within a trench, a narrow depression running along the floor like a hidden fault line. We peer downward and see formations that look like pillars or spires, rising just a few feet from the sediment, coated in mineral deposits and flanked by clusters of bacterial mats. Their white and yellow filaments moving in the faintest of currents and nestled among them. Creatures that look more like sculpture than life. Brittle stars with impossibly long arms. Polychaete worms that shimmer in metallic hues. A pale eel curled into a gentle spiral, its gills opening and closing in a slow, steady rhythm. And we realize that this space, this little fold in the earth, is an entire world. Complete and whole. Not because of its size, but because of its balance, its quiet perfection, its refusal to be anything but exactly what it is. We continue forward, and the lights catch something unusual. A reflective glint, sharp and unnatural. And as we approach, it becomes clear that it is debris, perhaps a fragment of an old deep-sea probe, or part of a cable. And around it, silt has settled, small creatures have colonized it, and in a way, it has been accepted. Absorbed into the ecology of the trench, not as a threat, but as material, as structure. And it is humbling to see how even our discarded tools, our forgotten instruments, become part of the landscape here. How the trench makes use of everything. And it forces us to ask what we've left behind. Not just physically, but symbolically. What traces of ourselves exist in places we've never been? What impact our presence has in the deep places of the world and of ourselves? We pause, letting the vessel float in stillness. The lights dimmed, the equipment silent. And for several minutes, we do nothing. No scans, no measurements, no images. Just breathing, just drifting. Just allowing the weight of it all, the pressure, the silence, the time, to settle into our awareness. And in that pause, something shifts, not outside, but within, as if we, too, are adapting. Becoming slower, softer, more patient, and we begin to feel, truly feel, the weight of darkness. Not as an absence, but as an invitation, as a space where things can unfold without interference, where life is not judged by speed or size, but by harmony, by endurance, by subtlety, and in that realization, we feel a kind of peace we did not know we were missing. A peace that is not about comfort, but about truth, about alignment, about remembering that life was never meant to be loud, that depth was never meant to be easy, and that sometimes the quietest places carry the most meaning. So we breathe and let the darkness hold us, and we continue, not because we must, but because we can. Deeper into the world beneath the world. The deeper we go, the more the ocean reveals not emptiness, but imagination made real, not a void, but a slow, surreal theater of forms that defy everything we thought we knew about biology. And as we drift along the floor of the trench in a place where pressure would flatten submarines not built for it, where temperatures hover just above freezing, where no light from the sun has ever entered, we begin to witness creatures so bizarre, so quiet, so utterly adapted to this impossible world that it no longer feels like we are looking at life on Earth. It feels instead as though we are peering into another planet, entirely one that has been growing and evolving in silence for millions of years, beyond the gaze of any observer, beyond the reach of cameras or probes or words. And what lives here is not broken or deformed as one might expect from the crushing pressure, but perfectly suited, elegant in its otherness, purposeful in its alien design. And the first we see is so faint, so ghost-like, we almost mistake it for a trick of the light. But as it turns in the water, a long thread-like creature reveals itself, its body transparent, its organs visible in soft reds and greens, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it has never once needed to hurry. And why would it? Here, speed wastes energy, panic is lethal, and calm is survival. It is a ctenophore, or comb jelly, and its body glows faintly, not in bursts, but in long waves of shifting color, refracting the lights from our vessel in soft rainbows that move along rows of tiny cilia used for locomotion. And as it rotates slowly, drifting like thought, we can see its feeding lobes stretched open, waiting for the passing touch of plankton, which in this place is more valuable than gold. And when a particle brushes against it, the lobes close gently, drawing the meal inward, not with force, but with patience. And watching it feels like watching a ritual, a ceremony of hunger performed with reverence, and we float nearby, unmoving, just watching this slow ballet take place in the pitch-black water. And we feel again that strangeness. Not fear, not awe, but something quieter. Something like respect for a life so different from our own, yet so complete. And it becomes clear that strangeness is not the exception in the deep. It is the rule, the norm, the expected response to a world ruled by pressure and darkness and slowness. Just below, nestled in the sediment, a strange shape begins to shift, not rising suddenly, but unfurling, unfolding like a paper sculpture in zero gravity. And we see now that it is a deep-sea octopus, small, pale, its arms covered in fine rows of suckers, its skin like silk, and it doesn't flee or dart away. It simply lifts itself off the seafloor and drifts upward, moving with such control that it barely disturbs the silt. And as it rises, its body pulses with faint color changes, blushes of blue-green ivory, and it seems to watch us. Not with intelligence in the human sense, but with presence, with awareness, with a kind of attention that is ancient and quiet and complete. And we remember that octopuses are among the most intelligent invertebrates known, their brains distributed throughout their arms, their neurons forming webs of sensation and action. And we wonder what this one thinks, or feels, or remembers, having perhaps never encountered anything like us in its long, slow life. We drift forward, passing by what looks at first like a pile of sand, but then the mound shifts and a long, flexible arm rises into view, followed by another and another, until we see the full creature, a giant amphipod, its armored body. Gleaming under the light, its limbs jointed and complex, and it moves with an eerie grace, part insect, part machine, part myth, and it scavenges through the soft sediment with quick, precise movements, uncovering tiny particles of decaying matter, pulling them toward its mouth, processing them through grinding mandibles hidden beneath its carapace. And this is how life continues here, in fragments, in patience, in recycling the old into the new. And this amphipod, this ancient-looking machine of hunger and survival, is as much a part of this world as the water itself. And as we watch it disappear back into the dark, we feel not like scientists or visitors or even explorers, but like dreamers witnessing a vision too vivid to have come from our own minds. Above us, something glows. Just once, a flash like a camera. Then again, and again, steady, pulsing, and we turn to follow the source and find a lanternfish no longer than a finger. Its body lined with tiny light-producing organs called photophores, arranged in perfect symmetry along its flanks, and it uses these lights not only to communicate, but to hide. Counter-illumination, it's called a way of matching the faint light from above so that predators below cannot see its silhouette. And in a world with no sun, light is not illumination. It is camouflage, it is language, it is strategy, and the fish moves quickly, darting away into the black. A single flicker among millions that happen every night in the oceans, unseen, unheard, but constant. And we are reminded that most of the light on Earth is not found in cities or in the sky or on screens, but here in the depths where living organisms shine in secret, unseen by anything but each other. Further along, a shape moves that defies easy description, long, flat, rippling like fabric in water. And as we adjust our angle, we see that it is a deep-sea ray, its body disc-like and undulating, its mouth underneath, its eyes oddly placed, and it flies through the water as if it were swimming through air. And there's a kind of poetry to its movement, a kind of elegance that speaks not of freedom, but of belonging, of having been born into this weight, this silence, this dark, and having found a way to make it not only survivable, but beautiful. And nearby, clinging to a rock, a deep-sea crab moves sideways, its claws oversized, its legs spindly, and on its back, a coating of bacteria, algae, or even tiny anemones forming a kind of living camouflage, a symbiosis so specific it has likely never been recorded. And yet, it works. It survives, it continues, just as it has for thousands of years. We pause near a cluster of tube worms, not the massive ones found near hydrothermal vents, but a smaller species, coiled in pale spirals, their feathery heads extended to catch particles from the water, and around them an entire community lives. Tiny shrimp, say-soaped, slow-moving snails, and all of them are bound together not by territory, but by chemistry, by the slow release of nutrients from the earth itself. And it is this chemosynthesis, this feeding on sulfur and methane and ammonia, that powers the deep in the absence of light. And we are reminded again that life does not need sunlight, it only needs balance, a source of energy, a way to process it, and a vessel through which that energy can become motion, memory, reproduction. And as we drift in this field of deep-sea life, it becomes harder and harder to remember that we are visitors, that this world is not ours, because it feels, in its quiet, in its rhythm, like home. And then, just ahead, something massive moves. Not fast, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable momentum of size. And we dim our lights, hold still, and let the creature pass. It is an oarfish, we think. Though it's difficult to be certain, its body long as a car, its fins waving like streamers, its face expressionless, its eyes huge and vacant. And it passes by like a slow train in the night, silent, shimmering faintly in the low light. And it feels not like an animal, but like an apparition, a myth-given form. And we feel something primal stir. Not fear, not awe, but a kind of ancient familiarity, like we've seen this before, not with our eyes, but in dreams. In the stories of old sailors, in the drawings of sea serpents etched into wood by candlelight. And then it's gone, swallowed by the black, and the water is still again. We pass a sponge the size of a barrel, pale blue in color, with holes along its surface, and nearby, a brittle star clings to a rock. Its arms, longer than its body, moving independently, exploring every surface with delicate precision. And across the trench floor, sea cucumbers crawl, leaving trails behind them like the wake of passing clouds. And it becomes clear that this place is not empty. It is not sparse. It is not a desert. It is simply slow, deliberate, patient, and every creature here is part of a larger rhythm, a larger breath, a larger system of life that operates not in seconds, but in seasons, not in motion, but in memory. We float there for a long time, saying nothing, doing nothing, just breathing, just drifting, letting the creatures of the trench pass around us like stories that don't require explanation, only observation. And in that stillness, we begin to feel something we hadn't expected. Not wonder, not awe, not even peace, but recognition. A feeling that these impossible creatures, these beings that should not exist, are not alien at all, but reminders. Reflections of what life becomes when it is shaped by patience, by adaptation, by listening, and we wonder, not for the first time, if maybe the reason these creatures feel so strange is not because they are distant from us, but because they are close, because they are life stripped of surface expectations, life without distraction. Life as it was, as it could be, as it might still become. Down here, where the seafloor has ceased to feel like a bottom, and instead becomes a kind of floating edge, a liminal threshold, between what is known and what is not, we begin to feel the presence of pressure, not just on the vessel, not just around the body, but deep within the mind itself, as if thought has been replaced by sensation, as if gravity no longer simply pulls downward, but presses inward from every direction at once. And at this depth, more than 36,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific, the pressure outside these walls exceeds 16,000 pounds per square inch. A number that becomes abstract until you realize it's like holding 50 jumbo jets stacked on your chest without a sound, without a shake, without even the faintest ripple. And yet, everything down here continues, moves, lives, evolves. As though this pressure is not a danger, but a teacher, not an obstacle, but an environment. And what thrives in this still cathedral of water does so not in defiance of the weight, but in communion with it, shaped by it, carved by it, slowly over uncountable generations into forms that make no sense to the surface world but fit here perfectly. With every organ, every membrane, every movement designed to accommodate a kind of force that we can barely imagine, let alone survive. And it makes you wonder how many other places in the universe appear hostile only because we have not yet learned how to see them as home. The vessel hums softly, systems holding steady. Internal pressure keeping us safe while outside the abyss leans inward with quiet persistence, and we float not like something dropped, not like a stone, but like something invited downward by the weight itself, gently drawn by the hand of gravity's patience. And in that descent, you begin to feel in the bones, in the blood, in the breath, just how massive the ocean is, not just in distance or depth, but in weight, in the sheer physicality of its being. Because water is not light. It is not gentle, it is not passive. It is mass, it is force, it is the collected memory of the planet pressing down over millions of years. And we realize that pressure in the trench is not a passing condition, but a constant one, and every creature here has learned to carry it the way we carry air, invisible, but total, intimate, unavoidable, and life in this world has evolved not only to tolerate that pressure, but to require it, to depend on it. And without it, their bodies would collapse, their structures would fail, their biochemistry would unravel. And that truth, that something can be so profoundly adapted to its world, that removing it from that world would destroy it, makes us reflect not only on these deep-sea creatures, but on ourselves, on the pressures we live with, seen and unseen, and which of those have shaped us, which have made us softer, stronger, more attentive. Outside, a small field of brittle stars lies half buried in silt, arms spread out like branches in a forest, slowly collecting whatever nutrients drift their way. And above them, a thin eel glides silently, its muscles rippling in smooth waves body, flattened by evolution into a blade that cuts effortlessly through the water. And it moves with such precision that it feels less like hunting and more like reading, like it is interpreting the water around it with perfect fluency, detecting shifts in current, changes in temperature, hints of chemical trails left by prey long past, and nearby, a cluster of white, delicate sea cucumbers crawl across the sediment, their long feeding arms extended upward, capturing invisible flakes from the water column with movements so slow they border on stillness. And we realize that here, movement is rare, not because it is impossible, but because it is precious. Because in a world where food is scarce and energy must be hoarded like fire, every flick of a fin, every curl of a limb must be worth the cost. And so the trench teaches stillness, not as resignation, but as wisdom, not as inertia, but as efficiency. And there is something almost reverent in that. Something that makes the chaos of the surface world feel far away, less important. We drift lower now, following the curve of the trench wall downward into one of its deeper pockets, a narrow chute that seems carved not by water, but by time itself. And within its shadows, the light from our vessel dims almost completely. Not blocked by objects, but swallowed by the blackness, by the sheer density of the deep, and in that darkness we catch glimpses, movements, reflections, small flares of light from organisms that live entirely in shadow, adapted to exist without ever being fully seen. And, as one of them passes near our lights, a creature long and soft, gelatinous, trailing threads behind it like ribbons, its body flexing with each pulse, we see in its form something fragile, something temporary, and yet it lives, it endures, it glows. And we begin to understand that pressure here does not crush life, it sculpts it. That what would destroy us has instead refined these creatures into expressions of what is possible when life listens to its environment instead of trying to dominate it. Along the trench floor, the sediment is fine and light. Layers of marine snow pressed into delicate folds by ancient currents. And as we pass over them, we see tracks. Marks left behind by creatures we cannot see. Soft grooves from the movements of sea cucumbers, tiny drag marks from isopods, even burrows that rise like chimneys from the mud. The homes of worms that may never leave, spending their entire existence in tunnels they dig by touch alone, filtering microscopic life from the water. And around one such mound, a pale crab picks its way carefully across the floor, its claws lifted like it's tiptoeing, as if aware of how fragile the world beneath it is. And we follow it for a while, watching as it stops, turns, tests the sediment with one leg, then proceeds, and the slowness of that decision, the care in each motion, tells us more than any instrument ever could about how life functions in a place where every action must count. We pass a hydrothermal seep where warm, mineral-rich water escapes from beneath the crust, not in violent jets like at vents, but in slow, steady pulses, and around it, life clusters. Small clams, mussels, mats of bacteria that shimmer under light and rising from between the rocks. Soft-bodied tube worms, their bright red plumes extended like flowers into the dark, gathering chemicals to feed the symbiotic bacteria inside their bodies. And it is here that we remember that deep is not barren, it is fertile. Just on a scale and in a language that is unfamiliar, and in this pocket of warmth, this anomaly in the endless cold, we see that pressure is not the only force at play. Heat, chemistry, time, all combine to create an ecosystem that does not resemble any reef or forest, but is just as complex, just as balanced, just as alive. We rise slightly, following the path of a long, slow current, And the water feels different here. Thicker, somehow more dense with life, and soon we begin to see the reason. Tiny organisms, planktonic creatures glowing softly spiraling in schools, creating kind of underwater aurora around us, and among them, fish. Not large, not fast, but many. Their bodies sleek, their eyes large, their movements careful. And we realize we are in a deep pelagic bloom. A place where nutrients have concentrated and life has responded, and even here. Under this unthinkable pressure, where light does not reach and food is measured in molecules, the ocean finds a way to flourish, and we watch it unfold around us like a dream. Soft, slow, surreal. And then, as we drift once more toward the trench floor, something vast looms in the distance. Not a creature, not a rock, but a field, an expanse of sediment stretching farther than our lights can reach. And on it, rows of strange objects. Not natural, not artificial, but something in between. Perhaps fossilized vent chimneys. Perhaps ancient coral-like formations, their surfaces weathered by time. And scattered among them, creatures both known and unknown. A transparent fish whose organs glow gently. A slow-moving ray with wings like paper. A worm that loops itself into perfect circles as it moves. And for a long while, we simply stay there, hovering above the field, saying nothing, moving only with the current and letting the presence of the deep fill every corner of our awareness. There is no conclusion here, no climax, no revelation, only the continued presence of weight. Not as burden, but as truth. The understanding that pressure, like silence, like darkness, like sleep, is not something to resist, but something to join, to accept, to become part of. And in that joining, we are changed, not dramatically, but deeply, subtly, permanently. And as the trench floor passes slowly beneath us, as the pressure holds us tighter, we do not feel crushed or small or afraid. We feel equal, balanced, returned, and ready to continue. Somewhere between the motion of our breath and the stillness of this trench, we begin to lose track of time, not in the casual, forgetful way that happens during sleep or daydream, but in a deeper, more profound way, as though the very idea of time itself no longer applies here, as though the rhythms of day and night of minutes, ticking on clocks of sunrises and calendars, are foreign languages in this abyss, where no light has ever touched, where no wind ever blows, where the only motion is that of water and gravity, that of drift and decay. And as we float in this place that feels more like a memory than a destination, we begin to sense that what we call time above the surface, those restless schedules and frantic hours, has no meaning here. That, in the deep, life unfolds not in sequences or urgency, but in presence, in cycles, in waves of becoming and resting and becoming again. And it is here, in this timelessness, that we begin to see more clearly. Not with our eyes, but with something softer, something older, some sense within the body that understands how to recognize rhythm without counting it, how to recognize life without labeling it. And in this long breath of the ocean floor, the trench reveals itself not just as a geological feature, but as a kind of sanctuary. A place where everything unnecessary has been stripped away, where only what is essential remains. Above us, far above, the surface still dances with weather, with storms, with sunlight that glimmers and fades. But down here, it is always the same, always dark, always still, always cold, and yet never lifeless. And as we adjust to the rhythm of the deep, we find ourselves no longer waiting for anything, no longer anticipating or rushing, but simply moving as the water moves slow, wide, unhurried like breath, at rest like thought, just before it becomes language. And in that space, life appears again, not in flashes or sudden color, but in form, in function, in subtle presence. An anglerfish, drifting like a ghost, its lure swaying gently before its tooth-ringed mouth, its body shaped by millions of years of ambush and darkness, existing in a perpetual now where it does not chase, but waits. And beside it, smaller fish float upward and downward without direction, guided not by light or landmarks, but by temperature gradients, by the memory of chemical signatures, by instincts passed through uncounted generations that tell them where the water has been and where it is going. And we follow them, not because we must, but because they seem to know how to move in this world, in this time that is not time. In a small pocket of seafloor, nestled between folds of volcanic rock, softened by eons of sediment, we find a community so delicate it seems impossible. Tube worms, clustered like stalks in a silent garden, each one home to billions of bacteria living within its body, converting chemical energy into nourishment, a process not powered by the sun, but by the earth itself. And among them, translucent shrimp dart with movements that seem to fast for this place, though still slower than their cousins above. And around them, small snails with shells so thin they're almost invisible spiral across stones, leaving behind trails that shimmer briefly in our light. And here, in this microcosm, time is not something measured, but something experienced. Not something that passes, but something that accumulates. And the longer we watch, the more we feel that this is not just a glimpse of another way to live, it is a reminder of something we have forgotten. That the world does not rush by default, that life is not defined by speed, that stillness is not laziness, but wisdom. And in this revelation, something in our own breath begins to change again, becoming slower still, becoming part of the rhythm that surrounds us. We move forward, passing over fields of sediment where strange patterns appear in the soft layer spirals. Ridges, shallow trough sand. It takes a moment to realize that these are tracks, left by creatures whose entire lives may take place within a square. Meter creatures that dig and burrow, that feed on particles of organic matter, invisible to our eyes, that know only this world, this soil, this water. And it makes you wonder how much happens beneath our notice, not just here, but everywhere. How much life goes on in places we never look, in ways we never consider, because we are too fast, too loud, too busy believing that what we see is all there is. And down here, surrounded by forms that exist entirely outside our systems of measurement, it becomes obvious that time is not a line but a circle, not a clock but a pulse, and that maybe the only real time is the kind that beats softly beneath the surface of things, the kind that lives in the quiet, in the in-between, in the way deep-sea creatures rise and fall, not by second or hour, but by hunger, by temperature, by instinct alone. We float above a trench wall that rises like a mountainside carved from shadow, and along its face we see structures that could almost be called architecture pillars, shelves, small caves where creatures hide and feed and rest. And as we pass, our lights catch the eye of something large, something slow, and from the shadows, a deep-sea jellyfish unfurls itself, its bell expanding like a parachute, its tentacles trailing behind it like threads of smoke in zero gravity, and it moves without any need for direction, simply pulsing in rhythm with its own body. And as it drifts upward and away, it becomes less a creature and more a shape, a presence, a gesture made of water and memory. And we let it go, watching as it becomes smaller, then disappears into the dark, leaving behind a silence that feels full, not empty. And then, just beyond the reach of our lights, something shifts, a subtle change in the water, a pressure that doesn't press but invites, and we realize that we are approaching one of the trench's deepest points, where the seafloor flattens into a kind of quiet basin, a place where currents slow to stillness and sediment gathers in thick, undisturbed layers. And as we descend into it, we begin to feel as though we are entering a sacred space, not because it is divine, but because it is untouched, unspoiled, unchanged by time or history, or even us. And there is something about the stillness here that goes beyond quiet, something that feels like truth, a kind of truth that doesn't need to be spoken, that cannot be argued or proven, only felt. And as we rest in this place, surrounded by darkness and dust and water and weight, we feel a kind of surrender we didn't know we were searching for, the kind that doesn't ask us to let go, but simply shows us that we already have. A creature passes slowly, just above the seafloor its shape. Unfamiliar somewhere between a ray and a slug, its body wide and soft, its underside glowing with faint blue light, and it leaves behind a trail in the sediment that spirals in on itself before fading completely. And we follow its path for a while, not to chase it, but to understand it, to see what it sees, and as we do, the silence deepens, the water becomes heavier, and even thought begins to dissolve into something less distinct, more fluid, more dreamlike, until we are not thinking in words but in feelings, in pulses, in a language older than language. And perhaps this is what time really is, down here, not a line but a sea. Not something that moves forward, but something we move through, slowly, silently, carried not by clocks, but by currents that do not care for numbers or names. And still, life continues, not despite the pressure, not despite the darkness, but because of the man. This truth echoes in every form we pass, in every stillness we witness, in every small glow and slow breath and suspended moment that stretches without end. And it begins to feel less like we are exploring and more like we are being explored, less like we are discovering and more like we are remembering. And this remembering is not intellectual, but cellular, somatic. Like something inside us recognizes this place not from maps or photographs, but from myth, from inheritance, from something passed down before memory had words. And the trench becomes less a destination and more a return. We are deep now, not just in distance, but in presence, and as we float in this world without time, without hurry, without conclusion, we realize that there is no goal here, no destination, only continuation, only depth, only this moment. And this one, each one enough, each one complete. And we let that be enough. There is a place in the trench, deeper than silence, where even sound begins to feel like an artifact of another world, where vibration no longer moves the same way it does in the open ocean, where voices, engines, and even breath become muted. Beneath the weight of water so thick and ancient, it feels like the air inside a forgotten tomb. And here, in this profound stillness, something extraordinary begins to emerge, not in color, not in light, but in form, in behavior, in presence, because the life that exists in this realm does not communicate with sound, nor does it require noise to survive or thrive. And in that absence, we begin to witness a kind of being we are not used to, a kind that speaks not through language or display, but through motion, posture, chemistry, light, and the very structure of its body. And these soundless life forms, as we begin to call them, live not in silence as emptiness, but in silence as richness, a silence full of meaning, intention, and design. And to understand them, we must let go of our need for noise, for music, for signals we recognize, and instead allow ourselves to observe without explanation, to watch without narration, to feel without defining, because down here, meaning is not spoken, it is sensed. We float gently above a narrow shelf of rock, barely distinguishable from the soft, dark silt around it, and it takes a moment to notice that resting along its surface are dozens, perhaps hundreds of small, flat creatures, their shapes blending perfectly into the seafloor, their colors muted grays and browns, their movement almost imperceptible, and only when our lights pass over them at just the right angle do we see the shimmer of skin, the twitch of a fin, the tiny undulation of gills drawing in dense water and releasing it in slow, even pulses. And we realize these are deep-sea flatfish, evolved for invisibility, their bodies compressed into living shadows, their eyes shifted upward to monitor the faintest changes in light, pressure, or vibration. And while they do not speak, do not call, do not roar or sing, they are clearly aware of each other, of us, of the invisible web of sensation that connects all living things in this world. And as we hover silently, they do not scatter or hide. They simply remain still, remaining, part of the structure of the deep itself, just beyond them. A strange formation begins to emerge from the darkness, a towering pillar of mineral and sediment rising like a sunken obelisk from the trench floor. And wrapped around its base are trails, thin, twisting lines in the dust, some spiraling outward, some cutting sharp turns, and we follow one of them slowly, tracing its path through a small cluster of rocks until we see what made it a ribbon worm. Several meters long, translucent and pale, its head raised slightly above the floor, sensing, not with eyes, but with chemoreceptors that read the water like a story. Its movements smooth and deliberate, guided by gradients of temperature, scent, and pressure. And it glides forward without sound, without pause, its body folding and unfolding like silk in water. And this, too, is language not ours, not one we can replicate, but language nonetheless. Communication between creature and current, between skin and sediment, and in that realization, we begin to question what it means to be voiceless, whether speech is necessary for meaning, or whether meaning is something that emerges even in the absence of words. A bioluminescent glow appears ahead, soft and distant at first, like the faint flicker of a lantern seen through fog. And as we move toward it, the glow intensifies, not in bursts, not as a flash, but in a slow pulse, like breathing. And we see now that it is not one creature, but many a school of deep-sea hatchetfish, each with a slender, silver body and light-producing organs along their undersides. And they hover in formation, suspended in the water column, their lights coordinated in subtle rhythms that shift and change. And it becomes clear they are not just lighting themselves for camouflage, but communicating, aligning their position with one another, coordinating movement without noise, without sound. And the harmony in that display is almost musical, even though it makes no sound. And as we drift through their midst, they part gently, surrounding us like a river of stars, then merging behind us again. Never colliding, never confusing, their silence more expressive than any spoken language. And we are left with a feeling not of loneliness, but of inclusion, of having been witnessed, not judged, not feared, but recognized as another presence within the fold. We descend again, letting gravity carry us deeper along the trench's contours, and at this depth, the darkness has become so complete that our lights seem to be swallowed as quickly as they are emitted, absorbed by particles in the water, by layers of life we cannot see, and we begin to imagine that there are creatures all around us, invisible until illuminated, and even then only briefly glimpsed before they vanish again into the deep. And that thought is not frightening, it is comforting. The idea that we are surrounded, always, by life we do not need to name in order to respect, by beings who live in worlds layered over ours, intersecting through water, gravity, and pressure. And as we pass a hydrothermal seep, we see exactly this: a colony of ventworms, clustered around a crack in the seafloor that releases warm, mineral-rich water, and among them, shrimp with no eyes. Their backs coated in bacteria move in measured steps along the rock, and small crabs scuttle between patches of growth. Their bodies pale and mottled, each one silent, each one part of an ecosystem built entirely on presence rather than performance. The soundless lifeforms here do not broadcast, do not seek to be seen. They simply are, and their being is enough. Their function is clear. Their survival is the result of having learned over countless generations how to live in tune with their surroundings. And we are reminded, once again, that sound is not the only method of communication. That noise is not necessary for complexity. That silence is not absence, but presence. And this world beneath the world is full of that presence, thick with it, humming with it at frequencies too low, too subtle, too old for us to perceive. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the deep is not here to show us anything, but to let us feel something. To let us remember that not all life shouts, not all life performs. Not all life needs to be loud to be powerful. A gelatinous creature passes near. its body undulating in the slow rhythm of the trench, long tendrils trailing behind it like the tails of comets. And it does not react to us, does not shift or shy away. It continues on its path, slow and beautiful. And we think perhaps it does not even know we are here, not out of ignorance, but because its awareness does not rely on sight, on sound, but on currents, on the chemical touch of other beings in the water. And that is perhaps how all things here understand one another, not through eyes or ears, but through closeness, through overlap. Through the way the water holds their shape and carries their intention, we hover. Silent, letting the environment envelop us, letting the soundless life forms continue their lives without interruption. And we begin to sense that even in stillness, there is conversation between water and rock, between pressure and form, between life and the absence of light. And the longer we stay, the more it feels like we are learning not facts, but truths, not data, but meaning. And that this meaning is not complex, but deep, not loud, but enduring. And it begins to shape the way we move, the way we breathe, even the way we think. In this depth, with no sun, no surface, no human systems. There is only the soundless world, only the creatures who call it home. And their presence is not something we have earned or deserve. It is simply something we are allowed to witness, briefly, gently, before we drift onward again. There comes a point, deeper than darkness, deeper than silence, where the trench no longer feels like part of the ocean, no longer like a seafloor or even a place, but something more ancient, something more primal, a layer of the earth so far removed from the world above that it exists not just beneath the sea, but beneath history itself. And as we drift further into this quiet descent, something begins to shift on outside, but within us, if the weight of the planet is no longer pressing against us, but inviting us inward, drawing us down not into water, but into memory, into a kind of geological dream, where everything we see is not just a habitat or an ecosystem, but a fossilized thought, a crystallized silence, a sedimented prayer laid down over millions of years. And here, in this depth where even the bioluminescence fades to faint pulses and shadows, we begin to feel as though we are not exploring the ocean anymore, but traveling beneath the very bones of the earth, moving between ribs of basalt and folded sheets of tectonic crust, gliding past the scars left by collisions older than the continents themselves. And as this realization settles into our breath, we understand that time is different here, not measured in days or centuries, but in shifts of stone, in the quiet grinding of mantle against crust, in the slow, sacred erosion of the planet's original shell. The walls around us are no longer smooth, no longer soft slopes of sediment, but jagged formations, towering cliffs carved by ancient movement, ridges of compressed rock that bear the stress of unimaginable force. And as our lights sweep across them, we see layers-thick bands of mineral and dust, each a record of some event lost to history, each one a bookmark in a story written long before there were eyes to read it. And we pass these layers like pages, like memories pressed into stone, and it feels as though the trench is revealing, not its secrets, but its truths, not its creatures, but its origins. And within these ridges and faults, we begin to glimpse the architecture of the Earth's beginnings, the traces of the moment when ocean met crust, when heat met pressure, when chemistry met life. And what we see now is not random, not chaotic, but ordered in a way deeper than design, as though the Earth has been building toward this moment all along, preparing this space not for us, but as part of itself, as part of the way it breathes, expands, and contracts across eons. Along one vertical face of stone, we spot strange protrusions, stalactite-like growths that jut outward into the water, some with small vents of mineral-laced seepage, others coated in filamentous bacterial colonies. And it becomes clear that this wall is not just rock, but a living surface, a habitat for organisms so old and slow they almost defy the word alive. And nestled between these structures, we see movements, insect-like forms crawling over the rock, their shells thick and ridged, their limbs slow but deliberate. And these creatures, likely a form of polychaete worm or deep-sea arthropod, are not scavengers in the traditional sense, but engineers, shaping their environment, filtering nutrients, creating microhabitats for smaller organisms, and as we watch them move in silence, in darkness, beneath thousands of meters of water and stone, it becomes impossible not to feel reverence, not just for the life we see, but for the persistence that allows it to exist at all. Beneath us, the floor levels out again, forming a wide, quiet plain littered with mineral nodules, some the size of fists, others as small as pebbles. And these nodules are more than just stones, they are archives. They are the result of millions of years of slow chemical accumulation, layers of manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt forming atom by atom around a central fragment. And each one is a timeline, a relic, a geologic journal of the deep, and we pass over them slowly, aware that some of these nodules began forming before humans stood upright. Before ice last covered the poles, before the moon's distance was what it is today. And this realization, this sheer scale of time and process, causes something in our minds to slow further, to stretch, to soften. We begin to understand why so many of the creatures down here appear almost still, not because they are dormant, but because they are in rhythm with something older, deeper, something the surface has forgotten in its hunger for speed. Ahead, a ridge rises, long and narrow, and atop it we see a field of strange structure stall. Hollow tubes made from compacted sediment, possibly built by unknown organisms, each one standing several feet high, fragile yet perfectly upright. And scattered among them are creatures we cannot immediately identify as slender bodies, soft and flexible, with appendages that move in slow spirals, gathering whatever nutrients drift on the current. And these organisms seem to belong to the architecture around them, their shapes matching the rhythm of the landscape, their colors faded into the same palette as the surrounding stone. And we realize that here, form is not separate from environment, that these beings are not just living in the trench, but expressing it, wearing it, becoming part of it. And it makes us wonder how many other forms of life we have overlooked because we were looking for contrast, for brightness, for movement, when in fact, the deepest life is often the most invisible, the most subtle, the most perfectly hidden in plain sight. We pause near one such organism, watching as it waves gently, responding to currents we cannot feel, and around it, tiny shrimp hover, their bodies semi-transparent, their internal organs visible in faint outlines, and even they seem to reflect the trench to mirror its silence and slowness. And in this stillness, a kind of understanding emerges not in the form of information, but in the form of feeling. A deep knowing that what we are seeing is not rare, not unique, but normal for this realm. And that the rarity lies not in the life, but in our witnessing of it. In the chance to observe something that has never been touched by sun or sound or surface. And the privilege of that witnessing humbles us again. Reminds us that the deeper we go, the smaller we must become, not in worth, but in ego, in volume, in presence, until we are no longer observers, but participants in the quiet. As we rise slowly along the far wall of the trench, we spot a formation that seems impossibly structured, arches of basalt layered over one another like petrified waves, their edges softened by time, their surfaces coated in silt and microbial films. And within their shadows, life gathers deep-sea eels, long and slow, their eyes adapted to the dark, their mouths full of curved teeth designed for prey that floats by unsuspecting, and between them, strange, soft-bodied creatures rise and fall like jellyfish, though their shapes are unfamiliar. Their movements not the pulsing rhythm of typical medusae, but something slower, almost mathematical, as if responding to patterns we cannot see. And for a long time, we simply watch, letting the movement of this hidden cathedral unfold around us, letting the gravity of the earth hold us in place as witnesses. To the sacred geometry of the deep, we pass near another hydrothermal vent. And though its plume is small, the heat it releases is enough to support a burst of life-white crabs, shrimp, and bacterial mats glowing in our lights like frost on stone. And among them, small fish dart in tight circles, their bodies covered in iridescent scales, their eyes wide and unblinking. And these fish do not flee from heat or sulfur or darkness. They thrive in it, born into it, molded by it. And we realize again that life here is not surviving despite the deep hit, is succeeding because of it. Because the deep provides more than pressure, and shadow it provides stability. It provides space. It provides the one thing that is increasingly rare at the surface, a place to exist without disruption. And as we drift, as we breathe, as we allow the trench to continue revealing itself without asking more of it, we begin to feel something unexpected, not awe, not fear, not even wonder, but something like familiarity, a sense that this place, though so distant from our daily experience, is not foreign to us, but rather a part of us, or perhaps we are part of it, shaped by it in ways we don't usually notice after all. Our blood carries the chemistry of the sea. Our cells echo the structure of ancient, single-celled life. Our ears detect balance through fluid-filled canals. Our dreams are filled with darkness and silence and shape. And maybe, just maybe, the reason we find peace in the sound of rain, in the quiet of night, in the motion of waves, is because something in us remembers this, because something in us was born here and has never truly left. As we drift further along the jagged folds of the trench, deeper than we've ever been, beyond the reach of warmth, light, and time as we know it, we begin to notice something quietly remarkable. Just the living organisms adapted to these abyssal conditions, but the living remnants of history itself, creatures so unchanged, so ancient in form and function, that they seem more like echoes than inhabitants, more like memories of life than life itself, and yet they move, they feed, they grow, slowly, invisibly, but undeniably alive, and in their presence we begin to understand that not everything that belongs to the past has vanished, that some things have chosen to stay, have persisted beneath the layers of extinction and evolution, waiting not for rediscovery, but simply continuing, breathing in the deep, where no extinction event has reached, where no ice age has swept, where no meteor has left its mark. And here, surrounded by silt and silence, we meet them, these fossils that still breathe, not trapped in stone, not frozen in time, but gently, pulsing in the dark, continuing the story of life in its earliest chapters without ever having left the page. We pass by a slope layered with sediment as fine as flour, gently rising and falling like soft dunes beneath the current. And among them are creatures whose shapes are unmistakably ancient brachiopods, filter-feeding animals that look like clams but are not, with symmetrical shells and stalk-like attachments that root them to the rock. And these animals once dominated Earth's oceans over 500 million years ago, long before the first trees, before vertebrates crawled onto land, before even the simplest dinosaurs. And yet, here they are, anchored to the side of a basalt ridge deep within the trench, opening and closing their shells slowly, rhythmically, in a gesture so small it could be missed if we blinked. But there is something profound in that motion, a kind of defiance, not I-seed, a kind of defiance, not born of aggression, but of endurance, as if simply continuing to live is their form of protest against the passage of time. And around them, brittle stars creep across the surface, their arms covered in fine spines moving in looping, spiraled patterns that haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years. Their body plan so successful, so elegant, that nature never needed to revise them in the shadow of a crumbling rock ledge. We spot a nautilus, its spiral shell pearlescent under the soft sweep of our lights, its tentacles exploring the water with delicate, probing movements. And this creature, too, is a relica cephalopod whose ancestors once ruled ancient seas, whose spiral shells now fill museum cases and geology textbooks. But here, in the dark, it is not extinct, not a fossil, but a being as present and alive as we are, floating through the water with the same coiled symmetry it's held since before the continents split. And watching it feels like watching time itself, condensed in two. A single slow pulse of life, a memory that never had to fade because it never stopped beating. And we float silently nearby, unwilling to disturb it, aware that we are witnessing not a survivor, but a continuation of something that never broke. We move further down the wall and come across an outcrop covered in long, slender stalks, gently waving in the current, and at first we think they are plants. But then we remember nothing photosynthesizes at this depth than these are crinoids. Sea lilies, not flowers, but animals, with feathered arms that capture particles drifting through the water, and though they resemble plants in form, their ancestry is purely animal, related to starfish and sea urchins. And once they filled ancient seas in vast forests, swaying together in shallow waters. But now only a few remain, and here, in the trench, they persist quietly, slowly, stretching their arms into the abyss like antennae reaching for a time when their kind ruled the ocean floor, and beneath them, small trilobite-like isopods scurry between stones, their hard plates gleaming, their antennae twitching as they follow chemical trails across the mud. And again, we are reminded that evolution does not always favor change, that sometimes what worked before still works now, especially in a place where the rules never shifted, where time moves not forward but outward, expanding slowly like breath, held in a sleeping world around a bend in the trench wall. The geology changes, and we see pillow basalts and sulfur-stained stone. And tucked between the folds, ancient corals, deep-water black corals, and bamboo corals growing at rates so slow they are measured in micrometers per year. And some of these colonies, we now know, may be over 4,000 years old, older than written language, older than most civilizations, and they are not dead, not fossilized, but alive, growing still, inch by patient inch, through wars and empires and entire eras of human history, and this kind of life so unhurried, so measured, makes us wonder how much we miss on the surface, how many miracles we overlook simply because they do not announce themselves with urgency. And it becomes clear that in the deep, slowness is not weakness, but mastery, and age is not decay, but refinement, as we drift onward, deeper into this museum of living memory. We encounter an animal so unusual it takes a moment to recognize it: a ghostly white fish, long and eel-like, with smooth skin and no scales, hovering just above the trench floor. And this is a deep-sea lizardfish, part of a lineage that dates back to the early Cretaceous period, and its expressionless eyes and wide mouth give it a strange, timeless appearance. And yet it moves with precision, with grace, its body coiled and released like a bowstring. And it feeds on whatever drifts too close, its jaws lined with sharp, needle-like teeth. And though it looks like something that belongs in a forgotten age, it is perfectly suited to this one. And in that harmony, we find again the lesson of the deep: that age and relevance are not opposites, that what is old is not obsolete, and that wisdom, in nature, is often built not in generations, but in geological eras. Above us, rising out of the shadows, a giant isopod swims into view, its hard shell curved like a battleship, its many legs moving in rhythm. And this creature, a relative of the pillbug, has existed in roughly the same form for over 160 million years. And though it resembles something mechanical, something designed for defense, it is soft on the inside, a scavenger, a cleaner of the ocean floor. And it moves slowly, methodically, with no fear, because it has adapted so completely to this environment that little threatens it. And watching it move is like watching a thought form slowly from some ancient source, as if the trench itself had conjured a shape to express resilience. And as we continue along the trench wall, we see more like it: horseshoe crabs resting in depressions, jellyfish pulsing with light patterns, unchanged since the Precambrian, fish whose DNA speaks of histories that go back before trees had leaves. And all of them still here, still breathing, fossils not buried in stone, but drifting in the black currents of the present. We begin to understand that the trench is not just a place of pressure and darkness, not just a deep cut in the crust of the earth, but a vault, a library, a sacred repository of life's early forms, protected not by walls, but by depth, by silence, by the patience of geology itself. And that what survives here does so not because it escaped evolution, but because it perfected a form so early that change was never necessary. And the awe we feel is not just biological, but existential, because these creatures have seen every age, lived through every extinction, witnessed every moment of planetary upheaval, and remained, not stubbornly, but gracefully, simply continuing to exist in the way the trench allows. We pause, dimming our lights, letting the darkness return. And in that silence we reflect on how much noise our species makes, how obsessed we are with progress, with invention, with movement, and how often we equate stillness with failure, quiet with irrelevance, age with weakness. But down here, nothing rushes, nothing pretends, and everything that lives has earned its place not by being loud, but by being right, by being in tune with forces we cannot see, with rules we do not write. And in that realization, something inside us quiets to not out of fear or humility, but out of respect for the creatures that remember a world we never knew, that embody the patience we've forgotten, that remind us that sometimes to endure is to win, and to stay the same is not stagnation, but wisdom. And so we drift onward, still surrounded by fossils that never died, by stories that are still being told, not in words, but in breath, in movement, in the slow, soft continuation of life in its most elegant, unchanging forms, and in the quiet between the heartbeats of the earth. We begin to feel what it means to be truly ancient, truly present, truly alive. There is a moment, as we float deeper into the quietest folds of the trench, when we begin to realize that this place, long thought of as mute, as void, as empty of voice, is in fact not silent at all, but full of a kind of sound so subtle, so slow, so layered beneath our ability to hear, that it becomes something else entirely, a kind of resonance, a vibration, a music that is not heard by ears, but felt by presence, by proximity, by surrender. And as we pass through this realm, it becomes clear that the creatures of the deep are not just surviving, they are participating in a symphony, not composed of melody or rhythm in the traditional sense, but of pulses, glows, flows of the movement of limbs and water, of bioluminescent signals and chemical trails, of shifts in temperature and the flexing of fins. And when taken together, this becomes a kind of language, a kind of choreography, a kind of song played not for us, but for each other. And though we cannot hear it, we can sense it in the same way we can sense the presence of wind without needing to see it, in the way we feel the stillness between raindrops or the weight of silence before a storm. And the deeper we sink into this weightless world, the more attuned we become to its music, until it is no longer foreign, no longer strange, but the most honest kind of sound we have ever known. We pass a school of lanternfish drifting in loose formation, their small bodies flickering with coordinated bursts of light, And these flashes are not random, not decorative, but deliberate: a code, a pulse, a map of meaning written in brief, soft notes across the water. And when we slow down enough to watch, truly watch, we see that each flash corresponds to the movement of another, that each glow is an answer to another, and that even in this darkest place, life finds a way to speak in light. And it is not unlike the way stars blink across the sky, each one separated by unimaginable distance, yet part of a shared story, a shared pattern. And in this watery sky, the trench becomes its own universe. The fish, its constellations, and the space between them not empty, but full of possibility, of message, of memory. Further along, we float past a hydrothermal field, its spires rising from the seafloor like organ pipes, venting mineral-rich steam into the dark. And around these vents, life gathers not chaotically, but in arrangement, in pattern, with crabs clinging to the warmest rock, with tube worms positioned in precise gradients to capture the perfect mix of chemicals, with shrimp huddled in layered rows, their bodies stacked like the keys of a piano waiting to be played. And it dawns on us that this too is music, not in sound waves, but in design, not in chords, but in coexistence. And the harmony here is not auditory, but ecological, where each life form has found a note to hold, a space to fill, a role in the greater composition of survival. And the more we observe, the more we see rhythm everywhere: in the flick of a fin, the ripple of sand, the expansion of gills, the slow cycling of light within translucent bodies. These rhythms, though voiceless, create a tempo that governs the deep like breath, like tide, like the slow, inaudible heartbeat of the earth. We pass over a valley of soft sediment, so fine and untouched that even the pressure of our vessel causes no disturbance. And here, there is almost no movement, just the faint shimmer of detritus falling from above, the ghostly descent of marine snow carrying nutrients from the surface, and the occasional twist of a burrow-dwelling worm repositioning itself in the dark. And yet, even in this stillness, there is structure, a kind of resonance in the quiet, as if the floor itself is listening, as if the absence of motion is part of the performance. And we begin to feel that this too is a kind of sound, the held note, the rest in a measure. The moment of inhalation before the next phrase begins, we understand that the deep does not need to be loud to be alive. That volume is not the only form of expression, and that in the trench, silence is not absence but texture, the space that allows other things to be heard by those who know how to listen. We notice now that many creatures do not communicate in ways we expect, but in methods so foreign they feel invisible chemical trails released into the water that carry signals to others miles away. The slow undulation of light along a jellyfish's edge, the subtle positioning of a limb, the timing of a movement, the stillness before a strike. And these elements are not just instinct. They are part of a larger communication system, a vast biological language that transcends sound, that trades melody for motion, pitch for phosphorescence, syllables for scent. And in this understanding, we realize that perhaps we have never been listening deeply enough. Perhaps we have missed entire conversations because we were looking for voices instead of presences, for signals instead of feelings, for songs instead of symphonies without sound. A small creature floats by, barely visible, a translucent orb with thin, radiating tendrils trailing behind it like silk. And as it passes, it pulses in rhythm, each wave of movement spaced exactly apart, like a heartbeat, like a metronome keeping time for the rest of the ocean. And nearby, a long, eel-like fish undulates slowly, its body moving in mirrored sync, not coordinated by sight or smell, but by the currents of the trench itself. And we realize that the water is the conductor here, the medium through which all soundless music travels, shaping behavior not by command, but by flow, by pressure, by temperature. And the further we drift, the more it feels like the entire trench is alive with a kind of music not played, but breathed, where every fin and flicker, every ripple and rest, is part of a score written by gravity and time. Along a narrow ridge, we find creatures that emit pulses of light at steady intervals, and while some flash brightly in bursts, others glow continuously, their light dimming and brightening like lungs inflating and exhaling. And these patterns are not identical, they vary in timing, in frequency, in hue. And we begin to understand that these variations are not random, but messages, rhythms encoded in bioluminescence, speaking of presence, of warning, of invitation, and perhaps even of memory. And what amazes us is not the light itself, but the coordination of it, the mutual recognition, the way multiple species seem to align their pulses with one another, forming temporary choruses of flicker and fade. And in this oceanic opera, we are not the audience, but the intruders, hovering on the edge of a music that never needed our ears to be real. And the music continues, not with crescendo or climax, but with the gentle persistence of breath, of current, of continuation. And as we float further still, we find ourselves letting go of the need to analyze, to categorize, to map each signal to a meaning. And instead, we begin to feel, to receive, to drift not just through water, but through awareness. And we understand, finally, that this is not a silence to be filled, but a symphony to be entered, a quiet we must become part of in order to hear. And in that stillness, something within us changes, not in knowledge, but in posture, in breath, in the softening of questions we no longer need answers to. And so we remain, floating in a world of messages written in motion, of language shaped by light, of songs without sound that have played long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone. And the trench, patient and eternal, continues to speak in its way, not to be understood, but to be witnessed. There is a kind of darkness in the deepest reaches of the trench that is not simply the absence of light, not merely the result of depth or distance, but something else entirely, something older, something more complete, a darkness so absolute that it has become its own environment, its own element, its own constant presence that is not waiting to be illuminated but has never known the idea of light at all. And as we continue our slow descent along the silent folds of the Mariana Trench, we begin to feel that we are entering not just a dark place, but a lightless world, a realm so ancient, so uninterrupted by the surface, that even the concept of sunlight is meaningless here, has never touched these walls, never sparked these creatures, never guided their rhythms. And in this realization, we start to understand that the absence of light is not a limitation, not a deficit, but a condition, a rule, a canvas upon which life has written an entirely different kind of story, one without vision, without shadow, without reflection, where every movement, every adaptation, every sense has evolved not around the visible, but around the tangible, the chemical, the magnetic, the felt. And that this world is not in waiting, not in hiding, but complete in its darkness, full and thriving in a way that no camera could ever truly capture. We drift slowly across a narrow ledge, our lights the only artificial glow in an otherwise pitch-black world. And around us, life continues without any need for what we carry, without need for color, for beam, for reflection. And we begin to notice how few creatures even respond to our illumination, how many of them remain indifferent to our presence, not startled or drawn or repelled, but simply unaffected, as though they do not perceive light as information, as though light is not part of their world at all. And perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it never was, because this deep, this far beneath the sun, light is not a variable light, is an impossibility. And in this impossibility, life has built something extraordinary, something we cannot fully understand, because we are creatures of light, born under the sky, evolved with shadows and cycles and dawns and sunsets. And here, none of that exists, has ever existed, and never will. And yet, life endures. Not in spite of that, but because of it. A slow-moving creature drifts into view, its body long and transparent, trailing thin filaments behind it that glow faintly with bioluminescence, not as a display, not as a lure, but as a sensory map, a tool for feeling the water, for detecting motion and change and chemical shifts. And as it moves, its filaments twitch and vibrate, responding to currents we cannot detect. And this, we realize, is how it sees, not with eyes, not with light, but with sensitivity to flow and texture and vibration, and around it. Other life forms pass: blind fish with vestigial eye sockets, worms that follow chemical gradients, mollusks that communicate through pressure pulses, and in every case, we see the same pattern: life that does not mourn the absence of sight, that does not miss the sun because it was never part of their story, never part of their evolution. And what has developed instead is a suite of senses so refined, so attuned to the deep, that vision seems crude by comparison, seems blunt and slow and limited in a world where pressure and scent and memory create a far richer map of reality. We pass by a cluster of sea cucumbers resting on the soft trench floor, their bodies pale and swollen, feeding slowly on the sediment, digesting particles too small for our instruments to detect. And above them, a small school of flashlight fish drifts past, their bioluminescent patches blinking in quiet rhythm, not to reveal themselves, but to coordinate movement, to maintain formation in a world where sight is personal and light is currency. And nearby, a large jellyfish pulses silently, its body faintly glowing from within, each pulse of its bell releasing not just movement, but faint, diffused light, barely enough to see, just enough to communicate its presence, its direction, its boundaries. And this, we realize, is how the deep speaks, not in words, not in signals, but in pulses, in glows, in slow, rhythmic expressions of being that do not need eyes to understand. We hover in place, turning off our external lights, letting the darkness return, letting the trench reveal itself on its own terms. And at first, it feels like we have vanished, like we have dissolved into the void. But then, slowly, we begin to see the true night of the deep, the faint glimmers, the soft flickers, the delicate threads of light produced by living organisms that never needed the sun, that never evolved for beauty but for function. And in their faint illumination, the trench becomes something else, entirely a sky turned inward, a galaxy, pressed beneath the sea, where each glow is a star, and each movement a constellation being drawn in real time. And for a moment, we forget that we are underwater, forget that we are explorers, and simply drift among these stars, these tiny sentient lights, each one writing its own chapter in the darkness. There are creatures here whose entire bodies are tuned to detect trace signals in the water-minute changes in salinity, in temperature, in electrical fields, and they do not navigate by seeing, but by feeling, by remembering, by reading the deep like a living text. And as one such creature passes, its body long and narrow, its skin covered in tiny sensory hairs, we can almost feel the quiet intelligence of it, the way it moves, not randomly, but purposefully, not by instinct alone, but by experience. And we begin to wonder how memory works in the deep, how stories are passed without sound or sight, how generations teach each other without faces or gestures or spoken language. And we realize that knowledge here is not taught, is embodied, passed through DNA, through environment, through the slow, constant presence of the trench itself. And that, in this world, knowledge does not need to be communicated. It only needs to be remembered. We move forward slowly, passing beneath an overhang of rock so large it feels like a ceiling, and beneath it, more life urchins clinging to the stone, Fish resting in place, anemones swaying slowly in a current so gentle it's almost imperceptibly in here. 2. There is no light, not even the flicker of bioluminescence, just presence, just form. And we begin to understand that even in the total absence of visibility, life finds its place, finds its method, finds its harmony with its surroundings. And we are reminded again that light is not necessary for perception. That perception itself is a broader, deeper thing than we often allow, and that in the trench, perception is not about image, but about integration. Not about seeing from a distance, but about knowing from within. Somewhere above us, kilometers of water pressed down with the weight of continents, and still the creatures here swim and drift and build and feed. Not aware of the pressure as we feel it, but shaped by it, tuned to it, dependent on it, and in the same way, they are shaped by darkness, not as victims of it. Not as inhabitants forced to adapt, but as beings for whom darkness is home, is nature, is life itself, and that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson the trench offers. Not that life can exist without light, but that life can begin without it, can flourish without it, can be beautiful, intelligent, complex, and complete without ever needing to see. So we drift onward into deeper stillness, deeper dark, deeper presence, not searching for anything, not expecting revelation, but simply moving through this space that has never known sunlight, never needed it. And in doing so, we begin to let go of our own need for brightness, for explanation, and instead settle into the slow, silent rhythm of the trench, where every flicker of light is a sentence, every movement a memory, and every breath a continuation of a world that was never broken, only hidden. There is a stillness in the bottom of the trench that feels like sleep itself, not the light drifting of a surface dream, but something older. Slower, deeper sleep without memory or waking, where time forgets how to move and gravity becomes less a force and more a thought pressing gently from all sides. And as we sink into this place that is not above or below, but simply beyond, we begin to feel the weight of the ocean transform, not as burden or pressure, but as presence, as a soft, all-encompassing cocoon of temperature and texture, where the silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something more complete, more profound, a kind of auditory hush that exists not just around us, but inside us, where heartbeat and breath and awareness all slow into something quieter. And it is here, in this absolute stillness beneath the currents and the noise and the memory of sunlight, that we begin to understand what it means to truly let go, to allow the body and the mind to be held by the earth itself, to stop measuring and moving and calculating, and instead to simply be suspended in a depth so perfect and unmoving that it feels less like falling asleep and more like being remembered by the planet, as if the trench itself has wrapped its arms around us and said, "Yes, this is where you belong," not as explorer or visitor, but as something simpler, softer, quieter, like a thought or a breath or a drop of water too small to name. We hover in place. The lights dim to a whisper, and the seafloor spreads out beneath us like a slow exhale, a plain of fine dust and ancient silt, shaped by nothing but time and patience, and across it move creatures we cannot name, shapes that shift and dissolve. In the periphery of vision, organisms that might be fish or jelly or something older, something without a word in our language, and they drift and pulse and slide with the kind of grace that comes not from agility, but from never having needed to rush. And as we watch them, we feel ourselves sinking, not just through the water, but through layers of thought, through the many veils of what it means to be conscious, each one thinner and gentler than the last, until eventually there is only sensation, only breath, only this slow rhythm of being in a place where nothing interrupts and nothing insists and nothing pulls us back to the surface. In this depth, time folds in on itself like soft cloth, and we begin to forget how long we've been here, not because we've been here too long, but because time itself has stopped keeping track. And in that forgetting there is peace, not like sleep in the human sense, but like a merging of mind and world. A dissolving of boundaries where we no longer feel like a separate thing looking at a separate world, but instead like part of the world itself, like the water and the trench and the creatures and the silence have all accepted us into their rhythm. Not as something foreign, but as something familiar, something slow enough now to match their pace, something quiet enough now to be trusted with the secret music of the deep. And we wonder, in this moment, if this is what it means to truly rest. Not to lie still, not to close the eyes, but to become so fully part of a place that the body stops needing to defend itself, and the mind stops needing to ask questions, and the breath simply continues as though it has always belonged here. We drift past a creature barely visible, its outline soft and gelatinous, trailing long threads of light behind it that pulse every few seconds. And as it moves, the threads curl and uncurl like fingers brushing across the water. And nearby, a colony of bioluminescent plankton rises slowly from the seafloor, their tiny bodies twinkling in soft spirals like sparks drifting upward from a dream. And between them pass other shrimp with translucent shells, worms with glowing spines, soft-bodied fish that move more like fabric than flesh. Then the entire scene unfolds, not like a display, but like a lullaby. Slow and quiet, and full of details that seem designed not to be seen, but to be felt. And we let ourselves feel it, not with the eyes, but with the breath, with the softness behind the chest, with the place in the body that responds to music even when there are no words. And as we drift among them, we are no longer watching them. We are floating with them, not above or around, but inside this strange, slow orchestra of life that has never needed the sun to know how to move. And perhaps this is what the trench is really showing us. Here at the end of our descent, not just that life exists without light, or that beauty can arise in silence, but that stillness itself is a kind of intelligence, a kind of wisdom that we've forgotten, and that resting is not failure or weakness, but simply a different way of being, one that does not measure value in movement or noise, but in presence, in the ability to simply exist without disruption, without demand. And as we let that lesson settle into our breath, we begin to understand that sleep, the real kind, the kind that restores and heals and folds us gently inward, it's not just something that happens in the dark, but something that happens when we finally return to rhythm, when we match the stillness of the world around us and stop trying to be something separate and down here in the deepest part of the ocean. That rhythm is everywhere, in the movement of sediment, in the pulse of water through gills, in the quiet light of plankton and the slow dance of unseen currents. And we let ourselves fall into it completely, like a feather falling into snow. Not falling down, but falling deeper, falling inward, falling home. No voice calls us back. No signal marks the end. No clock begins to count again. There is only this dark cradle of silence and motion and breath, this world that has always been here, waiting not to be found, but to be joined. And in that joining, we feel something shift not in the world, but in ourselves, like some tightness has finally loosened us. Some old noise has finally quieted. And we realize that the journey was never about reaching the bottom or finding something new or proving something, but about remembering something simple and quiet and vital, that we are allowed to rest, that we are allowed to be slow, that we are allowed to dissolve into stillness without losing who we are. And as we hover there, not at the bottom of the ocean, but at the soft edge of our own awareness, we let go of the last thoughts, the last questions, the last need to explain anything, and we simply remain, breathing in the deepest sleep the world has to offer. And still we drift, not upward, not outward, but deeper into the feeling that maybe we were never separate from this place at all. Maybe the trench was never something to explore or conquer or even survive, but something meant to reflect something inside us, something slow and quiet and unspoken. The part of us that aches not for answers, but for stillness, that hungers not for meaning, but for rest. The part that carries the memory of weightless water and long darkness and slow breath. And now that we are here fully, here we know. Longer need to reach or name or even know, because this presence is enough. This hush is enough. This being held by something vast and gentle is enough. And though the surface waits far above, with all its noise and brightness and clocks and tays and chatter, we do not feel it calling us back. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Maybe never again in quite the same way. Because now we carry the rhythm of the deep inside us, the stillness of the bottom, the pulse of silence, and wherever we go next, we will remember how to listen to it. Let me know if you'd like this piece extended or used as an outro or transition. Ready for anything next, a new topic, a new series, or polishing this one into final form.